morning, Upward. It is so good to see you guys, for real. It is good to see you. Good to see some smiling faces in those chairs. Thank you for getting up and actually putting on clothes and coming out here today. Many of you are used to hearing me preach in your pajamas now, so it's going to be an adjustment for you. I've heard that. One guy told me this morning when he came in, he said, hearing your voice makes me want pancakes now. And he asked me if we would start offering pancakes during the service. So I'm not sure we're going to do that, but it's good to have you back. Thanks for being the church throughout the last 2.5 months that we haven't been able to gather physically. Our online attendance has been tremendous. Thank you for that. You've continued to serve. We've had several serving opportunities in our community. You've continued to show up. You've continued to give. We haven't been at church for 2.5 months, and we're still $20,000 over budget in giving. That's your generosity. We've been able to give in our community in such a powerful way and be a blessing in time of crisis. You've stepped up, and I want to thank you for that. We're beginning a series today called Prepared, and we're going to be talking about 4 questions that those outside of our faith a lot of times ask us as Christians, and they're 4 very deep and very important questions for us to be able to answer. The Apostle Peter said that we should always be ready to give an answer to those that question us for the hope that's within us. Meaning that as Christians, our lives should inspire people with hope to the point that they ask us, what is it you have? What is it about you? Explain your faith to me. The Bible says we should live in such a way that they come to us asking us questions, and we need to be ready to answer those questions. So we're going to be answering 4 very significant questions that everybody needs to contend with as they approach faith. Number 1, we're going to talk about today, does God really exist? Does God really exist? And how can I know that there is a God in heaven? It's a very important question, and you can't dodge it. You cannot dodge that question. Have you ever wanted to dodge a question? I heard Ravi Zacharias, the famous apologist who went home to be with Jesus last week. He told a story, and I thought it was so powerful. He said there was this remarkable engineering firm that was hiring a new engineer, and they needed the best and the brightest. So they were going to quiz each candidate to find out how smart they really were. So they had lined up about 100 candidates outside a door, and they'd walk into that office, and they would quiz them one at a time. So the first guy goes in applying for this engineering job, and they ask him, they say, suppose you were on a train, and in your compartment, it was too hot. And as you were going on your journey, it was really hot inside the compartment. What would you do? And he said, well, I'd roll down the window. And they said, well, good answer. Now, suppose that the train was moving forward at 60 miles an hour, and there was a cool breeze blowing in the opposite direction of the train at 20 miles an hour. And suppose that it was 80 degrees inside your room in the train, and it was 60 degrees outside. And you lowered the window, you rolled it down exactly 6 inches, exactly how long would it take for the temperature in your room to decrease by 10 degrees? Did anybody figure that out yet? The guy couldn't either. He said, I have no idea. And they said, well, you're not suited for this job. Next. So he leaves the room, and the guy who's second in line says, tell me what happened. And he told him the whole story. He said, you got to be ready for this. So the guy came in and he sat down, and they said, suppose you're on a train going down the tracks and the room is too hot. What would you do? He said, I'd take off my coat. They said, well, what if that didn't work? He said, I'd take off my shirt. What if that didn't work? He said, I would order a glass of water and drink it. They kept getting impatient with him. And they said, well, what if you were dying and about to gasp your last breath and it was too hot? What would you do? He said, I don't care what you ask me. I'm not rolling down that window. He didn't want to answer that question. The question of whether or not God exists is a very serious question that we all have to contend with. Jordan Peterson, a very popular psychologist today, who's written some really neat books, said this. He said he was asked on a college campus in front of thousands of college students whether or not he believed in God. And he said, one of the important things to understand is if we say we believe in God, we're going to live differently. And he's not a believer in our Christian faith, but he said, I try to live as if there is a God. I thought his statement was pretty powerful. If there really is a God who created the world, we will need to live differently because we've been created by God. It's a question you cannot dodge. Now, there are all kinds of beliefs about God. Atheism says that there is no God. Agnosticism says that there may be a God, but if he exists, he is unknowable and we cannot relate to him. That's an agnostic. Deism says that there is a powerful being who created the universe, but once he created it and started it spinning on its path, he now has left it alone forever and has no interaction with that universe. Pantheism says God is nature and nature is God. Monotheism says that there is only one God. Polytheism says that there are many gods. Have you gotten enough isms already about God? Are you satisfied? There are a number of different beliefs in God. Surprisingly, about 80% of Americans today say that they believe that there is actually a God. When asked if there is a higher power, 90% of Americans still say we believe there is some form of a higher power. Now, the Bible takes absolutely no time in its introduction to explain the existence of God. Here's what you get in Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1, the opening to Scripture, simply says this: in the beginning, God. He's just there. He just exists. There's no explanation of where he came from. There's no explanation of a beginning. There's no understanding given. It simply says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God is brought to us in the first chapter of the Bible as one who simply exists and has always existed. There is an all-powerful God. In the first chapter of the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, Jesus said, I am he who was and is to come. We simply have presented to us in the Bible a God who is eternal, who has always existed. Now, there are always people. Have you ever had anybody ask you, prove to me there's a God? Prove to me, not by the Bible. Now, people who don't believe in the Bible don't accept it, obviously. And they don't need a chapter and verse from you because they don't accept the Bible. They want some kind of proof outside of the Bible that God exists. And some of them want scientific proof. They want us to mathematically or scientifically prove that God exists. I'm going to tell you, if you only believe in things that can be scientifically proven, you're going to be a very unhappy person in life. You won't believe in love. My son got engaged yesterday. He put a ring on a girl's hand. I think they're still here. She's still back there. There's a girl wandering around after church today with a very sparkly finger, and she'll be glad for you to look at that. We'd have a hard time proving their love by science, but you can still observe it. Understand that to prove something scientifically, you have to be able to control it. You have to be able to contain it in a laboratory. You have to be able to replicate it. You have to be able to experiment with it. We serve a God, and as we believe in the Christian faith, we serve a God that is above science, that in fact created the laws of physics and the laws of science. We serve a God that cannot be contained in a box. He cannot be contained in a laboratory. He can't be replicated by our human effort. He's greater than all that, so we'll never be able to prove God with satisfaction to a person by the scientific method. But a better question is out there. Is there evidence in the world that God actually exists? Is there evidence of a creator outside of the Bible and outside of the Christian faith? And the answer is yes. There is overwhelming evidence out there that we can see with our eyes and experience with our senses that there is a creator. The philosopher Immanuel Kant made a striking statement, and it's actually written on his tombstone. He said, there are two things that bring me to awe in the world. And those two things are the starry hosts above me and the moral law within me. Powerful statement. The two things that bring me to awe. It's almost as if he said, the two things that inspire me to worship are the stars in heaven and the morality that's inside of me. I'm going to tell you, those are the two things evident in creation that point us to God. The creation itself that's around us and what God has placed in our hearts. Now, those two, I started to try to do both of those in one sermon, and I don't have time. So today we're going to talk about the proof of God that is around us. Next Sunday, we're going to talk about the proof of God that's already within us, that's been created and placed in our heart. But for today, what around us tells us that there is actually a God. The Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 1, very powerful statement. He said, they know, Romans 1:19, they know, when he says they, he's talking about the world. They know, all the world knows the truth about God because God has made it obvious to them. Did you hear that for just a minute? God has made himself obvious to the world through the world that he created. Creation makes him obvious. If you want proof of God, all you've got to do today is walk outside those doors at the end of this service, and you will see creation screaming to you that there is a God in heaven who created it all. Paul went on to say in verse 20, he said this, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities." Do you hear that? Through the things he made, they can see things that are invisible. That means when you walk in the woods, you can see things about God that you can't experience just through your physical senses. You can learn about God by a walk in the woods. Now, one of the most terrible things that's happened in our culture today is there's a false dichotomy, they call it, between science and faith. What the world would have us believe today is that you cannot be a person of science and a person of intellect and at the same time be a person of faith. The world would have us believe that if you want to be a person of faith, you have to abandon intellect, you have to abandon science, you cannot be a thinker. You simply have to jump off an intellectual cliff and just go about with blinders on your life to nature, just immerse yourself in faith. They say that if you want to really study science and learn about the world around us, you have to abandon faith because the two are incompatible. Nothing could be further from the truth. Paul the Apostle wrote this, and he said, through creation, we can actually see the invisible attributes of God. He went on to say that mankind has no excuse for not knowing God because he's evident. He's written on the sky. He's written in a beautiful field. He's written in the thunder. He's written in a flower. You can see who he is from everything that's around us. Back in the 1920s, this idea of science versus the Bible was really ingrained in our culture. There was a man in Tennessee named John Scopes, and he was teaching evolution in the public school in Tennessee. And at that time, it was illegal to teach evolution in the public school. And so he was being prosecuted for it. The American Civil Liberties Union hired an attorney named Clarence Darrow, a famous attorney in American history, to defend this man. Representing the prosecution was a three-time presidential candidate named William Jennings Bryan, and these two men went head-to-head, and it made the national news. It became a national spectacle in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. It cemented into many minds the idea that science and the Bible are incompatible. But the Apostle Paul says the absolute opposite is true. The things we see around us scream out that there's a God in heaven. Science will point you to God, not away from God. You can be a thinker. You can be an academic. You can be an intellectual and still be a person who believes that God created the heavens and the earth. It's absolutely possible. It even should be that way. We have a creator. I want to give you 3 statements today, 4 statements, maybe 5. Another good one hits me. First of all, the universe had an origin. The universe had a beginning. Everything we can see and touch had a beginning. Look around you this morning at all these beautiful faces. Look around you at some faces that are different faces from the ones you've been looking at for 2.5 months. Some new faces, some new people in a new room, right? Isn't it wonderful? Look around you today, and everything you see has a beginning. If I had an apple in my hand this morning, we could say that apple had a beginning. Where did the apple come from? The grocery store, right? That's what we think. The apple comes from a tree. But even the tree had a beginning. The tree at one point was a seed that was placed in the ground. And the seed was placed in the ground by a farmer. The farmer had a mother and a father who also had parents. And you can trace the apple all the way back to a farmer planting a seed in the ground, all the way back for generations. Understand, our mind and our thinking starts to break down because we can't understand anything that doesn't have a beginning, because everything in life that we experience and touch and feel or taste had a beginning, had an origin. Science calls that contingency. It means that everything that exists is dependent on something else for its existence, that nothing that we can see is self-existence and independent of something else. But here's what you got to wrestle with. How far back can that beginning go? If we push it back further and further again, there has to be something that was self-existent in the beginning, something that has always been, that gave birth to everything else. Because nothing ever comes, or something never comes from nothing. Are you with me this morning? You can't make something out of nothing. There has to be something that started it all. For years, science taught that the universe itself was the non-contingent, self-existent thing that had always been there, until science proved it wrong. See, the more we study, we keep getting pointed back to God. And the reason you don't hear as much about this is because, I want to say this respectfully, but many times when we're not living as if there is a God, the idea that there could be a God is threatening to our reality. And we would rather say that He's not there. But I want to tell you, the truth of creation is screaming to us that there is a real God in heaven. We thought the universe was the pre-existing, non-contingent thing till back in the 1920s, an astronomer named Edwin Hubble was peering through a powerful telescope, and he's the one that actually discovered that galaxies were still moving apart and that the universe was expanding at the rate of the speed of light. And he said, if those things are still moving apart, they must have been close at one time. And there was an explosion, and galaxies began to form and move apart. And he theorized that they're still moving apart today because in the beginning there was a big bang. And at the Big Bang, things started moving, and they're still moving today. Now, some Christians hear the word Big Bang and think, uh-oh. But let me tell you something. The Big Bang points us back to creation. See, what the Big Bang did, it said the universe did not exist forever. The universe had a definite beginning, and it was instantaneous and cataclysmic. And everything that we know, time, space, and matter in the world in front of us today started by a big bang that went boom, and it flew out, and it's still going. That sounds a lot to me like God said, let there be light. And forgive me, but I'll insert a word, and bang, there was. Sometimes we need the simple-minded and the common sense. A farmer said this. He was being taught about the Big Bang, and the farmer said, okay, I'll accept the Big Bang, but I have 2 questions. Where did the stuff that got banged together come from? And who banged it all together? Because something cannot come from nothing. An astronomer, Robert Jastrow, said this, and it's pretty powerful. Astrophysicist, exactly is what he is. Listen to this quote. He said, and the scientific community was really upset with this guy because he just told what he saw. He said this. He said, astronomers now find they've painted themselves into a corner because they've proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth. He said, as they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. He said that there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. See, behind the Big Bang, science can't go there. Something supernatural happened that not only produced matter and space and time, but it also produced the laws of physics by which they operate. I want to tell you, the Big Bang points us back to the creation account, that the universe began suddenly, and that everything that exists in our world began in a moment. And I would tell you that moment is when God said, let there be light, and there was. That's good news. The universe had a beginning. That tells me there's a God in heaven. Second statement, the universe has a design. When you look at the world around us, it has a powerful design. People want to say there was a Big Bang and it was all random. Most explosions, anybody ever seen an explosion? Anybody ever caused an explosion for fun? We like things go boom. Most of the time when I see an explosion, things are random and they fall into disorder. Explosions have a way of disordering things. We, on the other hand, are such a highly ordered species in a highly ordered world. Think about this for a minute. Earth exists in the only zone in our solar system that contains life. The Earth is going around the sun at exactly the right speed for us to stay the proper distance from the sun. If it slows down or speeds up, we're closer or further from the sun, which means we freeze or burn up. And the tolerances on those things are minuscule. If we slow down just a little or speed up just a little, we're dead. If the earth in its axis is not tilted exactly as it is, we don't survive. If a number of factors are not met to the millionth degree, life on earth could not exist. Somebody said, when you study the earth and life, it's as if somebody tweaked the physics. It's as if some higher power designed us to be here, because the chances of this all happening are mathematically 1 in 10 to the 138th power. That's a big old number. You ever seen a number that long? 1 with 138 zeros behind it? The mathematical chances of life springing up randomly are 1 in that number. In other words, impossible. This cannot just happen. If you see, here's the deal. The universe had an origin. The universe had a design. And all designs imply a designer. Somebody made it. You see the chairs in the sanctuary this morning. They're all spaced out. Those of you who complained that before you didn't have enough leg room, God has answered your prayer. And He's given you room to lay down if you, no, don't do that. But He's given you room to stretch out, and that feels good. Enjoy it while you can. These chairs all fit together. They all interlock together. How many think that was an accident? Why they all fit together is because somebody engineered them to be so. One philosopher said this. He said, if I'm out walking in the woods and I see a piece of tree bark lying on the ground, it is reasonable for me to assume it just fell off a tree. But if I see a pocket watch that's still ticking, it's reasonable for me to assume that someone dropped it there, and further still, that watch was designed and built by a watchmaker. All designs imply a designer. And for me to look at this complicated world that exists and then somehow arrive at the conclusion that all this just happened, I would submit to you respectfully that requires intellectual suicide much more than faith in a creator God. The world around us is screaming, God exists. When I first went to college, before I really accepted Christ, I was a biology major. And I sat in class after class with a professor who was determined to convince us there was no God. But the more that he talked about the intricacies and the systems and the complexity of just the human anatomy, if you want to believe in God, take an anatomy class and listen. And when he got to an end of a lecture about how the human nervous system works. And I saw the most fantastically engineered system that I'd ever seen in my life, and I could not believe how possible it was. And I said to that professor, how can you possibly tell me this happened? You have proven to me today that God exists. And it was a couple weeks later that I surrendered my life to Jesus Christ. Not in opposition to science, but from that professor practically pushed me to Jesus. Because when you see it for what it is, you understand somebody designed it. Here's the point, and we're going to land this plane. If God really exists, I'm not an accident. If all this is just random, there's no meaning. Do you understand that? If there was just an explosion and we crawled out of the puddle somewhere and eventually grew legs, then we're just animals. And I would submit to you, tossing God from our culture and our world is what makes us behave like animals. What we're going to hear next week is we are created in the image of God. That's why what's inside of us points back to a creator. But if I'm just an accident, there's no meaning in life. If I'm just an accident, all that really matters in life is my survival and my success. So it's fine. If I'm an accident, it's no problem killing someone else for my own convenience. It's no problem treating someone differently because of their race if I'm just an accident. Yet something inside of us tells us that that's wrong, and I'm getting into next week's message already. I'm not an accident, therefore life has meaning. I'm not an accident, therefore my life has purpose. I'm created by God in God's image. Therefore, I exist for a reason to serve Him and give Him glory. I would submit to you that if you will look at the world around you, you will see evidence that there was a designer and there was a creator, and you'll be compelled to surrender your life to Him. A famous evolutionary biologist named Stephen Jay Gould said this, and it summarizes for me the cold, naturalistic view that some take. He said this, he said, we're here because one odd group of fishes had a particular fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. He said, we're here because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age. We're here because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. He concluded by saying this, we may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. What a miserable way to think. He's right. We just happened. But God tells us it's different. He tells us we're made in the image of God. We're made like Him to serve Him. I'm a space nut. Any of you like space? Any of you think it's cool we've got astronauts orbiting the Earth right now for the first time since 2011? There are astronauts right now orbiting there. Any of you watched the launch yesterday? I think that is so cool. I watched it and just said, yeah, the whole time. I love it. Back in 1961, the second man to go into orbit was a Russian cosmonaut. And he made the statement when he came back. He said, I looked for God and I didn't see Him. Kind of an arrogant statement. I think when you acknowledge God, He directs your paths. That's what His Word says. I think when you acknowledge you have a Creator, you invite Him into your life. And I don't think it's any accident that after that snub in the face of God, the Russian space program came to nothing. They didn't get to the moon We were in a race. I think it's really cool, too. Now, I'm not trying to pit countries against each other. We need to get along and love around the world. It's not what I'm trying to do, but it was a competition. In 1968, the United States sent men away from Earth. It was a historic moment when people first left Earth and orbited around the moon. And they actually orbited the moon Christmas Eve of 1968. And you know what they said? When they came around the moon and they saw the Earth rising over the moon, they had prepared a statement, and this is what they said. They read from Genesis 1:1 and said, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And they read many verses out of Genesis 1. And I don't think it's an accident that 7 months later, we landed on the moon. I think God said, acknowledge me, you're going to accomplish great things. Walk away from me, and you walk away from your created purpose. There's a God in heaven, my friends. Every bit of reason and intellect we have and have been given when we walk outside those doors will tell us He's real. And I want you to know Him. I want you to walk in His ways. I want you to understand you're not an accident. You're created for a purpose. So let's dismiss any of this thinking that says science and God, science and faith are incompatible. Nope, they join together perfectly. When there's no agenda, when there's no suppression of truth, and an honest investigation of the facts will bring you to faith. Let's do this as well. Let's win people, not arguments. I don't want any of you taking anything I say today or anything we give you in this series and using it to triumph over somebody in an argument, but use it to attract them to the faith. Next thing I want you to do is when you walk out of this place today, I want you to look up at the sky and listen for what it says. I want you to look at a flower and get the message. I want you to drive by an apple orchard, and you can do that all kinds of places. What's God saying in all that? More than anything, I want somebody to come to Jesus Christ and to say yes to Him. Would you bow your heads with me today in this place? Watching online, would you do the same? We're so thankful for our online audience that's with us today. If you're listening, whether here or online right now, and you don't know Christ, God gave His Son, gave His life that we might have life. The God that created the universe lost us to sin, lost us to our own stubbornness. You and I have walked away from our Creator's original intent for our lives. We rediscover that again in Jesus Christ. Would you do this? Would you pray to invite Christ to be the Lord of your life? Would you just say, Jesus, I turn from my sin. I turn from my previous life. I ask your forgiveness. And from this day forward, I'll walk with you. Anybody here today in this place that would say, today is my day to say yes to Jesus, Pastor? Can I see your hand really quick? We won't embarrass anybody. Can I see your hand? Today's my day to say yes to Jesus. Anybody? If you're online today and today's your day, we rejoice with you. There's a button there on the website you can hit, or Facebook or YouTube. You can give us a comment there and let us know, and we'll reach out to you. This may be your prayer today. You still may have many questions, and you're wondering if God's really real. I say this a lot of Sundays, but this may be the prayer you pray, and it's a bold prayer. God, if you're really out there, show me. If you're real, reveal yourself to me. You pray that prayer, He'll show Himself. He'll make Himself known to you. So many good things happening. We received word a couple of weeks ago that our oldest member, named Marie, she's in a nursing home. She was diagnosed positive with COVID-19, and I talked to her last Thursday. She has recovered, and last Thursday she celebrated her 95th birthday. God's faithful. God's faithful. I'm going to pray over you today, and I'm going to believe God to use you for healing, not only physically. Our nation's in need of healing. You believe that? We're called to be the presence of Jesus wherever we go. We're called to stand for love, right? We're called to stand for serving people. Jesus can defeat racism. Jesus can defeat violence. Jesus has defeated all those things. And as we are His people out in the world, those things will be defeated. Amen. And we're just believing for that. I'm going to bless you today. Father, everywhere we go, everywhere these people go today, the presence of Jesus goes with them. The love of Jesus, the power of Jesus, the power to heal. Father, I pray your protection. I pray your healing. I pray your safety. But I pray that we'll be an influence in our world for truth everywhere we go. And I thank you for that in Jesus' name. Now go in the power of the Holy Spirit, the presence of Jesus. Make him known to your world. Love you so much. Thanks for being here. I'm going to ask you to exit everybody right out these side doors of the sanctuary as you go. We will see you next week. It's been so good to see your faces. Love y'all. See you again next week. Be blessed.